Greetings, friends of liberty. I recently chanced in the library of a friend upon a peculiar book of German philosophy by a philosopher who had matriculated from and later taught at the University of Königsberg. The philosopher was Immanuel Kant. The title of his book was The Critique of Pure Reason. My friend, much to my dismay, was taken with its contents, though I must say on borrowing his book I found Kant's style interminably convoluted and his argument, he forcing me to traverse 800 pages, unpersuasive. What our Teutonic philosopher proposes therein is that reason, the faculty itself, is held insufficient to understand the world, and that our perceptions are by their nature faulty. Not, mind you, that sometimes we might misperceive, as when a drunk, as happened not a fortnight ago at Almack's, imagined a royal horse and carriage arriving to bring him to Buckingham Palace. No! Instead, what Kant suggests is that our senses, even when sober, are deficient. Clearly, what is only deficient is Kant's use of his own reason. How indeed, for example, would this Kant fellow know if his senses and reason were deficient, which claim is here imagining true, if his senses and reason were themselves deficient in being able to reach that very conclusion? I dare say that this is a case of a philosopher wanting to have his cake and eat it too, which is not uncommon among the Germans. Now, if we desire an examination of this Kant fellow and his intellectual successors, found in your 21st century, we find in Stephen Hicks, an American objectivist philosopher, who sees right through Kant and the intellectual shenanigans of his many Teutonic and Gallic allies and successors. Hicks, associated with David Kelly in the Atlas Society, one of the objectivist splinter groups that emerged either during or after Ayn Rand's break with psychologist Nathaniel Branden, has here written a succinct and revealing history of Western philosophy since the Enlightenment, focusing specifically on and attempting to explain the rise of postmodernism and its many contemporary variations. We, of course, can see the many flavors of postmodernism all around us. In the claims of migratory academic Stanley Fish, who wrote a book entitled There Is No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing Too. In the misandric ravings of the dearly departed feminist Andrea Dworkin, who claimed of women that we are very close to death. All women are. We are inside a system of humiliation from which there is no escape for us. In the statements of French postmodernist Jean-François Lyotard, who said, "It is our business not to supply reality, but to invent illusions to the conceivable which cannot be presented." Interesting how Lyotard's last name oddly rhymes with retard. And finally, in the falsehoods of longtime Duke professor Frank Lutricia, who said, first, take the road to contradiction, it'll lead you, I promise, to the palace of wisdom, and then, not surprisingly, said later, in the end, everything is found to be wanting. No doubt, these postmodernists could put the White Queen to shame and easily believe many more than 6 impossible things before breakfast. As Hicks himself notes in his introduction, these postmodernists consistently swallow all sorts of absurdities, as, for example, that A, it is impossible to speak meaningfully about an independently existing reality. B, they denying that reason or any other method is a means of acquiring objective knowledge of that reality. C, they believing societally that human nature is not individualistic, but essentially collectivist. And D, are often found to have an identification with and sympathy for the groups perceived as oppressed. How did all this philosophical silliness start? As Hicks and many objectivists believe, more or less with the skeptical philosophy of the aforementioned Immanuel Kant, full professor at the University of Königsberg from 1770 onwards. As Hicks recounts, the decidedly pro-reason and realist philosophies represented by earlier thinkers, such as Francis Bacon, René Descartes, John Locke, and Isaac Newton, all luminaries of Enlightenment science and thought, were now subtly attacked by Kant. This started the intellectual movement of the Counter-Enlightenment, which Hicks defines as the era from 1780 to 1815. During those 35 years, Anglo-American culture and German culture split decisively from each other. Kant's book, The Critique of Pure Reason, then, was by this understanding the first salvo fired, and in it Kant claimed that actual reality, which Kant called noumenal reality, is forever closed to reason, and reason is limited to awareness and understanding of its own subjective products. How did Kant reach this destructive, skeptical conclusion? By arguing that, as Hicks says, for reason to be objective, it must have contact with reality. The most obvious candidate for such direct contact is sense perception. But what Kant precisely did is to attack the reliability of our senses by pointing out that, in a way, the process of perception is always a creation of our specific sensory organs, like our retina and optic nerve, and thus these organs are always mediating between reality and the object we're perceiving. So Kant claimed we're thus not seeing the object, but instead, for example, the signals that our retina and optic nerve send us. So he suggested we're seeing the signals and not the object. As Hicks points out, however, Kant's point fails because our sense organs have a certain identity, which means they have a certain consistency and thus reliability. And since they do, it means that we can, by testing, discover whether they are giving us accurate or inaccurate information. So by this method, for example, we can tell whether someone is colorblind or not. We can discover that truth because sensory information is accurate. And thus we can know that that person is mistaken when he sees a red object as gray. It is, in reality, red. In other words, our sense organs themselves can help tell us whether our sense organs are operating correctly or incorrectly. That's pretty doggone reliable if you ask me. Kant's fellow German philosophers, then and in the future, however, loved Kant's attack on reason, because reason was undermining the Protestant religion which many of them had grown up with and loved, and which they wanted to save from Descartes, Locke, and other Enlightenment thinkers who were often quasi-atheists. As Kant himself had said, showing his intentions, I therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. The result of all this, as Hicks says, is that with Kant, external reality thus drops almost totally out of the picture, and we are trapped inescapably in subjectivity. And that is why Kant is a landmark. Subsequent German philosophers took the skeptical baton that Kant had offered and ran with it. As Hicks says, understanding German philosophy is crucial to understanding the origins of postmodernism. Continental postmodernists such as Foucault and Derrida will cite Heidegger, Nietzsche, and Hegel as their major formative influences, all of them German thinkers. And this brings us to George Hegel. What Hegel did, as Hicks says, is to create a partially secularized version of traditional Judeo-Christian cosmology. And he did this by imagining that everything in reality is God. You, me, the dog, the leaf falling from the tree, all are just an aspect of God. So we, you and I, don't really exist. We're really God. Of course, this kind of philosophy where material existence is ultimately dependent on consciousness is called metaphysical idealism. And Hegel is one in a long line of German idealists who imagine not that consciousness is dependent on matter, as we all know is true when we see people die, but that matter is dependent on consciousness. The idealists get it exactly backwards. However, Hegel's God is a strange God, in the sense that since he's identical to the world, and the world, as we all see, is very imperfect, then God himself, in Hegel's philosophy, is not perfect, but instead constantly developing and growing and changing, just as the world always is. And this parallels the Bible too, in that God there is very imperfect, creating human beings and destroying them with a flood, needing to rest after 6 days of the creation, and creating a woman who had the unfortunate desire to want to eat a red delicious apple. In addition, since Hegel understood the world to be a humongous mind, the actual changes that were happening in the real physical world were the changing ideas that mind had. And he called that process of the absolute mind learning and growing thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the dialectic. Thesis is a thought of the mind, antithesis is allegedly its opposite, and synthesis is the new thought that emerges from the clash of the two events. So for Hegel, the whole course of human history represented this dialectic process of the absolute mind in operation. Now, if you think that's irrational, then you've missed the rest of German philosophy. That included Friedrich Schleiermacher, who contributed to the revival of Orthodox Protestantism over the course of the next generation. Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher, who advocated that we should all blindly follow God's commandments, just as Abraham did when he was ready to sacrifice his son Isaac at God's behest. Arthur Schopenhauer, who lauded the force of pure will in itself, and since he regarded reason as ineffectual, said of his fellow man that the majority of men are not capable of thinking but only believing, and are not accessible to reason but only to authority. And finally, Friedrich Nietzsche, who believed how pitiful, how shadowy and fleeting, how aimless and capricious the human intellect is. In one of the many wry remarks scattered throughout the book, Hicks says, in contrast to Schleiermacher, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, Kant and Hegel seem like champions of reason. And in the 20th century, there came Martin Heidegger, who supported the Nazis and who thought it important to ponder, why is there being and not rather nothing? Hicks then turns and shifts his attention to the other side of the Atlantic and philosophy in America. For the longest time, ironically, since now the stronghold of postmodernism is located there, the Americans, having such a strong English heritage, were imbued with their Enlightenment traditions. And although some in the 19th century headed to German unis to bring back Teutonic ideas, for the most part, American intellectuals and scientists remained relatively unaffected by the many German philosophical falsehoods we've surveyed. But as time went on, they were slowly influenced by continental developments. Hicks now pauses and says, after this whirlwind tour of 220 years of philosophy, I can now summarize and offer my first hypothesis about the origins of postmodernism. Postmodernism is the first ruthlessly consistent statement of the consequences of rejecting reason, those consequences being necessary given the history of epistemology since Kant. In postmodernism, we find metaphysical anti-realism, epistemological subjectivity, the placing of feeling at the root of all value issues, the consequent relativism of both knowledge and values, and the consequent devaluing or disvaluing of the scientific enterprise. He notes, too, how all these postmodernists are on the far left. He continues, commenting on Heidegger and his postmodernist children. Heidegger attacks logic and reason to make room for emotion. Foucault reduces knowledge to an expression of social power. Derrida deconstructs language and turns it into a vehicle of aesthetic play. And Rorty chronicles the failures of the realist and objectivist tradition. Nasty political correctness as a tactic then makes perfect sense. Having rejected reason, we will not expect ourselves or others to behave reasonably. Having put our passions to the fore, we will act and react more crudely and range of the moment. Having introduced us now to the history of German idealism and subsequently his basic explanation, he needs to cover a few more topics, and one is Marxism. As is obvious, the basic problem for the Marxists nowadays is, as with all these ideologies, reality. But here specifically, economic reality. It's clear that ever since Marx made his unfounded assertions about capitalism exploiting the worker, his libel that the lower, middle, and upper classes need to hate each other, and that history is inevitably proceeding to its end state of communism, that the opposite has occurred. So this, for over a half-century, has posed an ideological problem for all those who hate economic freedom. So Hicks thus believes that secondarily, postmodernism is the academic far left's epistemological strategy for responding to the crisis caused by the failures of socialism in theory and practice. In this, he essentially argues in the same way that Kant and the subsequent German idealists responded to the challenges raised by Descartes, Bacon, Locke, and others by creating ideologies of unreason. So too, the postmodernists are responding to the successes of modern capitalism and the demonstrated moral atrocities and mass murder and economic failures of Soviet and Chinese communism by these postmodernist responses. Specifically, he argues that, given the moral failures of communism, with its emphasis on from each according to his need to each according to his ability, with which they attempted to justify their violence, they now have switched to an emphasis on the achievement of equality as the justification for their violence. He spends a number of pages discussing this transition. Incidentally, I should also mention that he also throws a discussion of Rousseau in here, he reminding us of the many different ways that modern postmodernists are, like Kant and Hegel were, in sympathy, A, with Rousseau's statement that reason is what engenders egocentrism and turns man in upon himself, and thus, according to Rousseau, makes us less benevolent to others and thus less civilized. B, how the postmodernists are in sympathy with Rousseau's hatred of science. Rousseau is saying, the sciences, letters, and arts spread garlands of flowers over the iron chains with which men are burdened, stifle in them the sense of that original liberty, and make them love their slavery. And C, how the postmodernists love the collectivism found throughout Rousseau, who said, the power of the general will over the individual is total. Hicks further comments on this latter issue of collectivism by showing how in the 20th century, the left and the right diverged in Germany, with the left advocating a class-based or international socialism, and the right a nationally based socialism, i.e. national socialism. He also incidentally gives us a nice section on how Herbert Marcuse and the cultural Marxists of the Frankfurt School integrated Freudian ideas into Marxist theory to create a more psychologically sophisticated upgrade, which still, however, remains as implausible as orthodox Marxism itself was. So in conclusion, I think we can judge this book in three areas. First, as a general history and review of philosophies since the Enlightenment, and also in telling us why these are right or wrong. I think Hicks here does a superb job, especially for the introductory intermediate student, but also for those more experienced who just want a review from his classical liberal perspective. I would give the book overall an A-. The second and third areas have to do with his explaining, as his title says, his understanding of postmodernism. And in this, we can focus on two things. First, how he describes the movement changing qualitatively over time. In other words, how the specific ideas that thinkers believed change in response to other or prior thinkers and to events in the world. And secondly, whether he can explain the rise to prominence, societally and institutionally, of this ideology as a movement, which is a separate issue. Let's examine both of these. A. First, qualitatively, imagine the following. A group of, let's say, 40 Nazi skinheads who develop their own Nazi ideology, which, over the course of decades, changes as they discuss issues in history and interpret events in the world around them. So describing their ideology and how and why it changed would be in essence what Hicks does with regard to Western philosophy and various ideologies over the last 200 plus years. A qualitative analysis. Mostly this works well, although I think it becomes somewhat speculative when we reach postmodernism. B. But with our postulated group of 40 Nazi skinheads, we're not trying to explain why their membership has remained relatively small and not grown. That issue of their relative unpopularity is a very different intellectual task. And that issue, the quantitative change, Hicks doesn't really much address or try to. As I've done on numerous videos on this channel, this would be very different because it would involve discussing all the societal factors that can lead to an ideology becoming more and more popular and powerful. As I've often argued to a significant degree, the popularity of some ideologies in the history of the West, as Christianity, for example, in general, and Catholicism for over a millennia specifically, is not only related to their intellectual content and ideas per se, or the changes made by successive thinkers, but has occurred because those belief systems have simply received the privilege of governmental laws, money, and even violence in their favor to help them grow and spread. In a number of instances, Hicks bypasses or misunderstands this issue, the one of popularity, since in the case of all woke ideologies, the very reason that they exist, to any prominent degree, according to my understanding, has to do with the huge amount of monies that have flowed into the American system of higher education since World War II, which increase funded their ideological development on a massive scale. Another lesser factor is various anti-discrimination statutes of the Civil Rights Acts, which have reinforced and backstopped these ideologies in many institutions, educational, commercial, and governmental. And thirdly, all the many charitable tax breaks that private colleges receive that reduce the pressure that civil society could bring to bear on them to reform their departments and their irrational ideologies they nurture in them when these develop. But Hicks himself is unaware of these forces at work in facilitating the rise of woke ideology, since he says in the beginning, why is it that skeptical and relativistic arguments have the cultural power that they now do? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why have themes of exhaustion, nihilism, and cynicism come to have the cultural dominance they do? The answers to these questions, why they have the greatly increased power they do presently, and not just why they changed qualitatively, I just gave you. And Hicks never did. I'm very happy overall, however, to have read this excellent fusion of philosophy and history, describing how the ideas of the West have qualitatively changed since the Enlightenment. And I'm very happy, too, that your modern cars, the Germans make, are much better than the philosophies they export. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.